In this video, we're talking about social anxiety. Now, in order to understand and overcome social anxiety, we need to understand social hierarchies. What do I mean by this? Well, the vast majority of social anxiety is created by one of two main causes. The first one, which we've touched on so far and we're going to do in more detail later, and that's painful previous past experiences or negative or traumatic previous experiences that are still impacting you today. The second contributor to social anxiety is our positioning and our perception within our social hierarchy. Now, human beings have a natural tendency to compare ourselves to one another. It's something that we share, and it's a characteristic that many of the other animals in the animal kingdom have, and we humans just tend to do it in a slightly different way. So, for example, if we think about our genetic comparison, so we think about chimpanzees, they have a very clear social hierarchy, and there'll be those at the top of this hierarchy, and then there'll be people on the other end of the spectrum, right at the very bottom of the food chain, right at the bottom of that social hierarchy. So the way that we view ourselves and our perception of ourselves relative to those around us has a huge influence on how we feel and how social anxiety gets created. Now, when we communicate with other people, all of this is going on in the background. So all of this will be expressed non-verbally and it'll be expressed unconsciously. So you'll be giving off a certain vibe depending on how you perceive yourself, and then also you'll feel a certain way. The process of comparing yourself to others is also very, very flawed. So what we tend to do is we perceive ourselves to be lacking in some kind, so we're judging ourselves for something. We then find an example of someone who we perceive to have that very thing in abundance, so therefore we admire that trait in them. So effectively what we do is we pick a very narrow context where we perceive we're weak, and then we compare ourselves to someone who we perceive has an abundance of it. And it's that contrast that creates the feeling of inferiority, the feeling of low confidence, the feeling of being an imposter. So it's actually the contrast that contributes a lot towards it. So not only do we take and hold up what we think is a weakness and compare it to their strength, we also make the assumption that they have that characteristic all the time. So effectively, based on what we covered earlier, we generalize their abilities. If you spend enough time with someone and you spend enough time in different contexts with them, you'll very much see they have it in some places, but actually they do not have it in others. But rarely do we get that full picture. Most commonly, we have a very small amount of data to choose from, and it's often when they're demonstrating their most highly skilled area. So all of the sort of stats are stacked against you when it comes to comparing yourself with others. The more time you spend with someone, the more you realize that they do have both sides, and actually that usually starts to bring down the admiration, which then starts to diffuse social anxiety. One of the main reasons this shows up is if you are around someone to begin with, you might feel quite highly socially anxious, but actually if you are exposed to them day after day for quite a long period, often you get to see more of them, you get to see both sides of them, and then you start to feel more comfortable around them because you start to see, oh, actually, they're just a human being and they have their pros and they have their cons just like anybody else. So these comparisons are usually heavily stacked against you, and that creates that perception of inferiority. If we come back to social hierarchies, this actually plays itself out in the brain. So you have what's called place and grid cells in your hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. And these very special cells help to locate you in time and space. And they also help to locate you in terms of your position relative to someone else. So if you are interacting with someone and you perceive them to be better than you, or you admire them in some way, then what happens is these grid and place cells in like a social hierarchy, almost like a food chain, literally position that person as above you in your brain. And this is based on the groundbreaking research of Schaefer and Schiller. So it's all documented, it's a breathtaking bit of research, and it shows how you get positioned relative to how you perceive someone else. So if there are lots of people around you who you perceive to have a trait that you don't, maybe it's intelligence, maybe it's charisma, maybe it's articulation, then your brain registers them up above you and positions them above you in your social hierarchy. And if we think about it, we compare ourselves to family members, to friends, to colleagues, to acquaintances, to strangers, all the way up to media personalities. So if there's an area where you judge yourself and then you compare, that's one of the main scenarios that contributes to social anxiety. And the reason this happens comes back to the way our brain represents that information. So when you perceive someone to be up above you, so in your social hierarchy, you almost rank them up above you, your brain puts them in a position of predator. They are up above you, and it positions you in the prey position. So minimized, shrunk. That again creates the contrast. And if you've ever been sort of in a situation where you've got someone else towering up above you and you perceive they're watching or judging or doing something, and you're then trying to deal with that, it creates quite an intense anxiety very, very quickly. So if you think that scenario and that sort of dynamic is actually playing out inside your brain, then it's no wonder that you start to feel socially anxious around certain types of people and in certain types of situations. When we understand this social hierarchy and we understand, okay, based on our perceptions, our brain almost ranks us relative to other people, and then our brain perceives us in terms of, do we feel safe? So do we feel the overdog and we're looking down? Or do we perceive we're the prey and someone else is looking down on us? That has an impact on your physiology, which then feeds through to your psychology. When we understand this, we can apply very specific interventions to neutralize that, to bring everyone down to the same level, so that actually, rather than looking up to someone or looking down on someone, you're just speaking them level. So the playing fields are level. And when you feel equal and when you feel equally valuable, then social anxiety dissolves because you're free to be yourself, because you've liberated yourself from judgment and you've liberated your brain from feeling like you are the prey. So this is why social hierarchies is so key to understanding social anxiety and how to unravel it and clear it for good.